Well, sight reading has been an interest of mine for quite a long time. And I discovered why recently, actually. I found an old school report when I was about 8 or 9, and there evidently I was in a big class of 45, and they had separate areas for each topic, and reading was one of them. And it turned out that I was 44th out of 45th for reading. So I was obviously really bad at it. And one of the first books I surprisingly bought myself was a book about reading. So, you know, from when I was really quite a young lad, I've had this interest in reading. I must have been aware of not being able to do it very well. And I've just been fascinated by this whole process because I think it's a hugely important aspect of musicianship. I mean, there are many reasons for being able to do it. One of them, if we look from a sort of a quite high up down on the whole process, is that if everyone could sight read, the whole art will continue. If people can't read music, then and no one could read music, we wouldn't have an art. So the more of us that can read music, sight read is just reading it for the first time, the more chance there is of this great art in surviving. And I suppose that's why. And I've always had this desire to help people happily, and helping them to be better at sight reading is something nice to do, really. So I've created this quite extensive series, and now this new book, How to Sight Read, which looks at the actual process. So I kind of spent about a year working with all sorts of scientific people, optometrists and opticians and a sort of eye-brain specialists, to really get to the nitty-gritty on how we do it. And so that's how the book came into existence. And what this book does, which I don't think anyone else has done before, is that it suggests that sight reading is a technique which you can learn to do, just as you can learn your piano technique or whatever singing technique. And everyone, in my opinion, can learn it. Some people, a small number of people, seem to be able to sight read naturally. There aren't very many of those. A lot of those become teachers or musicians because they can kind of do it naturally. And because they can do it naturally, they think it's a natural thing, which some people can do and some people can't do, which has grown into this, what I call the sight reading myth, that some people can sight read and some people can't, which is patently not true. And so this book seeks to address this myth and suggests actually you can do it. I don't think there are particular reasons why some can and some can't do it. I think some people just know the myth and believe it for some reason, and they think, oh, I just can't do this. And I think if it's approached in a methodical kind of way, anyone can do it. I've divided this sight reading technique into 9 areas, and I suggest that each is developmental. So in other words, you can take any of these 9 areas and develop them independently, and then put together, you can sight read. And there's lots of that, and they're all fun things to do, basically. None of them are in any way tedious or boring or anything like that. They're all fun. And so, to give an example, one of them, which is very particularly interesting, I think, is improving our peripheral vision, which allows us to do lots of things. In the actual process of sight reading, it means that your brain has already begun to process what's coming next before you look at it. A bit like, a driver is using their peripheral vision and they notice things like a child about to come onto the road, and the brain notices that and then they look because the brain has picked it up before they've actually looked at it. And so there's all sorts of games how you can develop this. For example, if you look at something and you don't move your eyes, you realise that's called your central vision. You realise how small that vision is, and you keep your eyes still, and then you start to input the data, input things about what you're seeing in your peripheral vision. That is something that is developmental. So you can literally practice that every day, and it's quite a fun thing to do, and you can do it wherever you are. If you're sitting on a train or waiting at a bus stop, you can just look at something and you can develop your peripheral vision. And over time, without you even realising it, when you're sight reading, you begin to realise, I know what's coming next, even though I haven't actually looked at it yet, because you've developed that bit of the brain that inputs data from your peripheral vision area. So that's one, but there's lots of other fun activities as well. In every lesson. And I think if you kind of go through these 9 areas that I've developed, what you'll find is that you can do something from one of those areas in every lesson, because it will connect with another bit of your learning. Because all these areas, I mean, everything connects in the world. I mean, that's one of the things about the world. And as people realise that everything connects, it begins to make your world more understandable. It's just a kind of a thing that some people realise it, some people don't. But if you begin to understand how things connect, you have a greater understanding of the world. And these developmental areas all connect with other bits of musical learning, instrumental learning, singing learning. So you can make a connection with them. And you can do that in every lesson, maybe more than you actually think, more often than you think, and more of them than you think, because it will make that person into a better musician generally. Yes, I'm wearing my simultaneous learning tie. So simultaneous learning is, on my, you might know my map, my simultaneous learning musical map of the world, which is a lot of bubbles with all the things that make up music. And someone found this tie, which is, it's not really a simultaneous learning tie, but it looks very much the part. Simultaneous learning, there are 3 principles behind it. And they're very important, really. One is that every piece or every song that we learn is made up of ingredients. These are the ingredients that contribute to make up this piece or this song. And it's important that we make sure our pupils understand those ingredients. And I like to make sure that's the case before we start learning the piece or the song. So we know the ingredients, we understand them, they're in our mind. And part of making that understanding stronger is that we connect, we make connections, hence the simultaneous learning bubbles with all connections. And as good musicians, we kind of understand how those connections work. One of the things a good teacher does is to explain those connections. You know, this connects with that, and the people think, I understand that more as a result. So working through the ingredients, making the connections, and number 3 is doing it all proactively, which means in the simultaneous learning kind of teaching, it's the opposite end of play that to me and I'll tell you where you went wrong. The reactive kind of teaching. I'm not against that, but if that's the main way someone teaches and learns, ultimately it's quite demoralising. Because basically, I'm making mistakes all the time. You know, what is a lesson about? I go and make mistakes, and my teacher tells me where I go wrong. And I think that to me is very tedious. So here we set up the next activity based on the ingredients, based on a connection, whatever it is. And we set it up in such a way that we know, because of the last activity, that our pupil understands it and will get it right. So that is positively motivating and confidence building. So that's in a nutshell, because I mean, I've written a whole book about simultaneous learning and it's a bit more than that, but in a nutshell, that's what it is. So basically, it's a positive way of learning where both teacher and pupil are being creative and enjoying themselves all the time because they can do it. Yeah, I mean, these that they call them supporting tests, and I suppose in a sense that's a reasonable description because they support what we do. And each of those areas that you just mentioned are extremely important, really, if you think about it. And if they are brought into the teaching, brought into the learning in an imaginative, interesting way, the right connections are made, then our pupils will understand why they're doing it. You know, the kind of the teacher says, you've got to do scales and they're horrible, but you've got to do them for your exam. You know, there's no reason to misunderstand why that student will not think they're horrible and boring and I just have to do them for an exam. But if we explain, for example, scales, they underpin almost every shape in music, somehow or another, all musical shapes, you know, within the kind of type of music that we normally play or sing or teach. It's all based on keys, scale patterns, arpeggio patterns. So if we understand those, that will help us do our sight reading more because we instantly recognise them. It will help us develop our technique because we understand. I mean, what's the point of an arpeggio, for example? It helps us understand how we move around our instrument. because you have to do things fingering wise in order to move up or down on the instrument, and that's useful. And if we explain that in a useful way, it's not just a boring thing you do for an exam. It's going to enable you to express yourself more, play your instrument better. I don't see who's going to argue with that. And studies, they're interesting, most of them anyway. They increase your technique, and we need to have our technique, the ability to play the instrument, in order to play the tunes that we want to play. Or aural, it's understanding what we hear in order to do it better. For example, sound. Sound is not something that is tested in oral tests, but sound is all about perceiving the quality of the sound, understanding what that sound is, understanding, could it be better? How could it be better? What am I hearing? Do I have a model somewhere in my mind of the most beautiful sound I want eventually? And how do I move towards that? That's part of aural. All these things are helpful and interesting. Yes, that's an interesting question. What most people don't know, clarinet is my main instrument, and also piano. I did both at the academy. I actually did the violin up to grade 8 at school. Amazingly, I don't know how I managed to fit that in, but I've got grade 8 violin, so I kind of understand string instruments from that point of view. And I have lots of nice friends who played lots of different instruments. So, for example, I've just finished writing a trombone tutor, Trombone Basics, in the Basics series. And I've been working with a wonderful trombonist who has been kind of giving all the trombone ideas and how to make it all work. And that's how I do it. Sometimes I try to do some work on the instrument myself. When I did improve your sight reading for guitar, someone lent me a guitar, and I learnt to play all the pieces up to sight reading grade 5. I'm no guitarist, but I wanted to understand the technique, how it works. So I don't always do that, by the way, but sometimes in that case I did, and I learnt the guitar so I could play those pieces reasonably well to that level, but I understood what the technique required is. But so that's how I do it, and there's always someone out there who will help. There's lots of nice people in the world, and so that's how I do that kind of thing. Yes, I wanted to do that book, actually. I'd had that in my mind for quite a long while. I think that was the book before, the sight reading one. And human beings are very conditional. We are just very conditional. I'll do this if. And these are my conditions, or requirements is another word. If my requirements are met, I will do whatever this thing happens to be. And that's in every aspect of life, really. And when I started thinking about it and watching, I get sit in on lessons sometimes, which is always a privilege. Not always a pleasure, but it's always a privilege. And you kind of see that people have got their requirements, and if their requirements are met, then maybe we can move forward. But if they're not met, there is a block, and the teaching, the learning stalls. So I wanted to kind of talk about this, to make a list, as it were, of all the possible requirements, conditions that we may have in our minds. And it turned out to be quite a long list, and also very revealing, because not only do we have basic ones, like, for example, this room's very messy, I'm entitled to a better room than this, if you go away and teach at a place, why should I be put in a messy room? There's loads of them, and there's lots of hidden conditions as well that are deeply rooted in our psyche sometimes, but they are there, and if they're not met, we hit a block. So there is quite a long list of these things, and in the book I talk about them, and I say to teachers, I do a talk on it sometimes, don't worry about this, because we all have conditions, but think about it. Can you manage this particular condition better in order for your pupils to make more progress? That's a hidden one, for example, that a lot of teachers have, but they don't necessarily think about it, or think they have it, is that this is how I teach. My good pupils get it, my less good pupils don't. Rather than, this is how I teach this pupil, but I'm going to have to teach this pupil slightly differently in order to get the best out of them. And that's quite a deep, hidden condition, really. but I know it happens sometimes, and we have to have this vast array of strategy in our minds so that we can find the way forward for every pupil. You know, we don't hit road closed. We should never hit road closed. There's always a way forward. And I think if we begin to think through our conditions, we begin to find that the path is open, because it's conditions that block the way. I hope people enjoy that book if they read it. And I think it's, if I may say, quite an important one, really, because no one's talked about it quite in that way before. And suddenly we think, actually, no, I do have that condition. I can see how it might block certain pupils. And if I can manage it, control it better, we can move forward. And that's a lovely place to be. Well, happily, it was a very good background. It was actually my mother that decided on the clarinet. I don't know what instrument. I went to a nice school that had a lot of music in it, and at one year, everyone was given the opportunity to play an instrument, which was a string instrument, actually, and that's where I started the violin, and I took it up to grade 8. But I'd already started the clarinet by then, which was my mother's choice, to which I will always be thankful, because I had a wonderful teacher at school, and I just loved it. I loved doing all the music, and to begin with, I was in the choir. A bit later, I was in the school orchestra. A bit later, I formed the school music society, and I just had a great time doing music at school. Then I went to the academy and had John Davis was my clarinet teacher there, who was this wonderful teacher, wonderful wisdom, wonderful wit, and a wonderful sense of generosity. And I've always thought that's a very important quality for a teacher, to have a generous spirit, because I think teaching, in a sense, is sharing. It's not, I know more than you, and if you're lucky, I might tell you a bit of what I know. It's, I want to share this, and that seems to me a very nice way of teaching. And John was very much of that kind of ilk. And that's how it all kind of happened. I just loved it. I started writing little pieces. I still have my book of first pieces, which are not to be published, I think, at any point, but they're quite sweet. The spelling is appalling, because I was also not very good on spelling, as well as not very good on reading. But anyway, it was nice. And so music to me has always been a joy. Which is why I want it to be a joy for other people. And if I can be a bit serious, we live in a rather troubled world. If people could do music together, how much nicer would that be? And one of my favourite metaphors is the orchestra. You get a vast array, a big orchestra, 100 people maybe, lots of them playing different instruments, which are very different, playing different notes, but all doing it together, and the result is harmonious. It's a very nice metaphor. Composing for me has always, I'm not the sort of person who kind of wakes up and says, I have to write a symphony or I have to write a song. It's always been quite practical. And obviously I've written a lot of pieces for the various books I've done. And the pieces I write tend to be for either occasions or people. And so that's what gives me the motivation to write. And happily, that opportunity has always been there. I've always been writing little pieces. And the style I kind of write, it's sort of somewhere between Poulenc and Ravel and Malcolm Arnold, I think, because these are some of my favourite people. And that's the kind of style. So it's very accessible in style. It's not modern or anything like that. And it's fun. My most latest kind of proper piece is a friend of mine, Victoria Samick, who runs Clarinet and Saxophone Classics, the record label. It's coming up to her 30th anniversary of this label, and she is doing a 30th anniversary disc, and asked me whether I write some new pieces. So in fact, I've written a sonatina for E-flat clarinet, for bass clarinet, and for saxophone, and they're all going to go on her new disc. So all new pieces. But they were inspired by knowing Victoria, knowing what the occasion was for, and so it was a pleasure to write it. So that's really how that kind of thing works, really. Well, I'm just finished trombone basics. We've got 2 more to do in that series, and I think we've covered every instrument. We started with clarinet basics, which is my instrument, and then all these others have poured out. And we're going to do French horn and finally percussion, which is going to be quite a challenge, but that should be interesting. But the next book I want to write, and I've been thinking a lot about this, because it might turn out to be a bit provocative, and I want it possibly to have the title, Why Music Education Matters. Because all the books I write are short, because teachers don't have much time to read these things, so they're never more than about 90 pages. So I'd like to, lots of people talk about this at the moment, but I'd like to get all the ideas there in one book, and say, even to politicians, you can read this and maybe understand it, and understand why music is so important. It is so important. It's a wonderful thing. We know why it's important in the sense that it helps us develop as people. It's just a wonderful thing to do, though. There's a joy about it that takes us to a good place.